HOA was the last thing on my mind when I woke up that morning. I had a whole list of chores to do before noon and a report to finish for my off-farm job by nightfall. Yet before I could even tick the first item off my schedule, I found myself standing at the edge of my grandfather's old fields, fists clenched, watching a line of construction trucks churn the soil. The sight was so out of place that I stood there in disbelief for a moment, trying to process why there were cement mixers and bulldozers on what was supposed to be my private property. It wasn't until I noticed a row of bright orange stakes planted in the ground, each with a fluttering flag labeled Willow Glen HOA, that the shock really set in. I'd heard the rumors about the new homeowners association expanding like an invasive weed, but I'd never imagined they'd reach this far, let alone barge onto my land with their machines. My name is Daniel Reed. I'm a 32-year-old engineer by trade and a farmer by blood, thanks to the legacy my grandfather left me. These fields, this battered old homestead, even the rugged mountain dam about 2 miles up the slope, they all came as part of an inheritance no one else in the family wanted to maintain. Grandpa had built the dam decades ago to protect the town from seasonal floods, but city folks rarely remember the value of something until it fails. I certainly had no idea that one day that dam would become my best ally in a fight against a woman named Karen Summers, president of the Willow Glen Homeowners Association, who decided to stake her claim in my world and build 58 brand new houses on my soil. Karen appeared on the property shortly after I demanded to speak to whoever was in charge of this invasion. She stepped out of a sleek SUV wearing a tailored blazer, crisp white pants, and heeled boots that looked more at home on a fashion runway than on a muddy construction site. I noticed the way the workers seemed to give her a wide berth, as if she wielded some silent authority that compelled them to keep their heads down. She wore a polished smile, one that told me she thought she was in complete control of the situation. "Good morning," she greeted, voice polished and artificially sweet. "Is there a problem?" I took a moment to assess her, from the perfect curl of her hair to the manicured nails she drummed against a sleek folder. "Yes," I replied, eyeing the trucks, the stakes, and the men tearing through the topsoil. "You're trespassing. This is private land." Karen cocked her head, that friendly smile never wavering. "Actually, according to our updated survey and the most recent county zoning maps, this parcel has been designated for Willow Glen's new expansion. You might want to check your records." The arrogance in her tone made my jaw tighten. "The only records I need are the deed and titles in my grandfather's name, which passed to me. I haven't sold an inch of this property, so either there's some mistake or you're just hoping I won't push back." At that, Karen let out a measured sigh, like she was dealing with an unruly child. "We're well within our rights, Mr. Reed. If there's confusion, I suggest you contact the county clerk. Now, if you'll excuse me, we have a schedule to maintain." I might have argued right then and there, but I could tell none of these men would stop in my say-so. They were under Karen's orders, emboldened by some piece of paper that, in her mind, justified ripping my land apart. My first move was to drive into town, heart pounding as I navigated traffic, heading straight for the county office with an envelope of documents clutched tight in my hand. The clerk inside, an older gentleman who squinted behind thick glasses, pulled up the digital records. He frowned at the screen, cleared his throat, and said, "According to the revised zoning lines, your property has indeed been folded into the Willow Glen district. It appears that a portion of your family's original boundary was, well, let's say, reclassified." I felt like the floor was tilting under me. Reclassified? On what grounds? The clerk shrugged. "It says here the boundary was updated after a multi-year development plan was passed by the county commissioners, citing that the land was largely unused farmland in need of modernization. There might have been public notices. Did you see any?" The frustration bit into my chest. "I never received a single letter, email, or phone call," I replied. The clerk gave me a pitying look. That happens more often than it should. You could file a formal complaint, maybe even a lawsuit. Lawsuit. The very sound of the word weighed on me like a lead brick. Taking on an entire HOA, especially one with the ear of the county, would be an expensive, drawn-out war. But if that was what it took, so be it. Back at the homestead, I parked my truck near the porch and gazed out at the rolling fields. These acres were part of my lineage, a place my grandfather poured his soul into, building not just a farm, but an entire ecosystem anchored by the dam. That dam was older than me by at least 4 decades, constructed after a catastrophic flood once swept through the area. Grandpa never let me forget that day. He told me how people had lost their homes, how the valley turned into a gigantic lake overnight, and how the aftermath spurred him and a small group of neighbors to gather stones, logs, and earth to fashion a dam at the mountain's natural choke point. It worked wonders for years, controlling the water flow, but it wasn't some state-of-the-art structure with official oversight. It was a labor of love, a testament to what determined folks could do when they banded together. Now, the notion that all of it, including the farmland below, had been forcibly integrated into Willow Glen's development plan made my blood boil. I kicked at a stray pebble on the ground, sending it skittering across the porch. I resolved to speak to a lawyer, though I knew I didn't have the funds to wage a long legal campaign. Yet the alternative, standing by while Karen bulldozed my birthright, was even less acceptable. I reached out to a friend from high school, Thomas Callahan, who had gone into real estate law. We met at his cluttered office, a small space above a hardware store that smelled of dusty ledgers and stale coffee. He pored over my deed, frowned at the county's new zoning map, and tapped his pen against the table. "You have a strong claim," he said. "But these HOAs often manipulate fine print. You'll need more than just your family deed. We should gather everything from historical surveys to any environmental reports on the dam. If we can prove that changing the zoning poses a risk, we might be able to halt their construction." Risk. That word latched onto my consciousness. The dam was crucial, protecting not only my farmland but also the lower valley. Could Karen's crew be so reckless as to mess with the natural water channels? Thomas seemed to read my mind. If they're building roads and homes near the flood channels, that alone is cause for concern. And if they so much as touch that dam— He shook his head, trailing off. I spent the next several days doing exactly that, combing through Grandpa's old paperwork, rummaging in boxes stacked in the barn, pulling out wrinkled diagrams he drew by hand to show how water would flow into the reservoir. I found yellowed newspaper clippings about the big flood from decades ago, detailing how the newly built dam saved the region from devastation. My mind raced with the realization that the only reason we never had a second flood catastrophe was because of that dam's integrity. And now Willow Glen had come along, with bulldozers and rebar and the full confidence that they could just plop a suburban paradise right on top of this historically unstable ground. Every time I drove by the site, I saw more progress. Heavy machinery cutting swaths into the land, foundation outlines popping up like fresh scars. It was surreal. The scale was massive. 58 houses, a community center, even talk of a small shopping area. The corners of my mind pulsed with anger at how quickly they were transforming my fields into a development zone, all under the banner of progress. One afternoon, I approached Karen on site, determined to get clarity about how they intended to handle the dam. She was in the middle of touring a group of potential investors, but I cut right in, ignoring their baffled stares as I called her name. She turned, raised an eyebrow at my audacity, and then gestured for the investors to give us a moment. "Yes?" she asked, crossing her arms over a crisp blazer that didn't have a single speck of dirt on it, despite the construction dust swirling around. "You're building near the dam," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "That structure keeps floods from washing away half this county. Your equipment is disturbing the surrounding hillside. Are you aware how dangerous that is?" Karen gave a thin smile. We have engineers, Mr. Reed, professional ones at that. They've determined everything is safe. Our developments always adhere to the county's regulations. Unless you have a more advanced degree in civil engineering than the experts we hired, I suggest you leave it to the professionals. She turned to rejoin her group, but I grabbed her elbow, softly but firmly. You're going to regret ignoring the significance of that dam, I muttered. Karen's eyes flared, and she pulled away, clearly offended. I regret nothing, she answered, her tone clipped. And you'd best be careful, Mr. Reed. I could file a complaint for harassment. I let her go, heart pounding. The frustration and fear in my gut twisted into something darker as I watched her walk off with the investors, smiling as though I didn't exist. Meanwhile, the county remained slow to act. My lawyer filed the necessary paperwork, calling for an urgent review of the environmental implications, but the hearing dates kept getting pushed. Willow Glen's legal team responded with countersuits, alleging that I was a nuisance, that I was interfering with lawful development. They slapped me with a stack of threatening letters. It became crystal clear that they were prepared to spend whatever it took to keep me entangled in red tape, all while pushing ahead with construction. In the middle of all this, I realized that nature might succeed where the courts were failing, because if the rainy season arrived in full force, and that dam had been compromised by their excavations, there would be one powerful message no jury could overrule. As the days went by, I made detailed notes, took pictures at every stage of the land alteration, and recorded any sign of structural tampering near the dam. Some nights I barely slept, haunted by the idea that a well-placed storm could unravel everything. Eventually, the creeping thought emerged that perhaps that was exactly what needed to happen. I'd grown up helping Grandpa maintain the dam, patching cracks, clearing debris, making sure the water channels stayed functional. Lately, though, with my job in the city and all the legal chaos, I hadn't had time to give it the care it deserved. If the dam were neglected, if I simply stood by, it might degrade enough that a heavy storm would blow it wide open. Could I live with that? The moral conflict weighed on me heavily. On one hand, I wanted to protect innocent people from a potential disaster. On the other hand, Willow Glen's arrogance made me think they needed a rude awakening. I wrestled with that dichotomy for weeks, torn between the desire for justice and the risk of unleashing something uncontrollable. I noticed the tension building one morning as I stood on the crest of the dam, surveying the cracks that had spread since the last rainy season. They were still superficial, but left unchecked, they could become catastrophic. The reservoir behind me was calm, reflecting the sky like a giant mirror, but I could almost feel the power of the water, straining to be released. Some of the earthen buttress below had been disturbed by recent machinery. I saw fresh tire marks inching dangerously close to the main spillway. It was as if Karen's crew were gambling that the dam was just old dirt and rocks, never suspecting it was the only thing preventing the valley from turning into a lake. Eventually, I set my jaw in determination. If they wanted to treat my warnings like empty threats, then they could face the consequences of ignoring the land's natural rules. And so, I made a choice. I would no longer do the maintenance that kept those cracks from widening. I wouldn't sabotage anything, but I wouldn't preserve it either. I gathered all my records, preparing for the day I would need to show how I'd tried to warn them, how I'd filed complaints, taken photos, and requested inspections. If or when that dam broke, there would be a clear trail of negligence on Willow Glen's part. Karen, of course, kept up her sunny PR face, boasting about the new homes selling like hotcakes. Families from out of state were snapping up properties in what she called the best hidden gem of the region. She posted on social media about the tranquil environment and scenic views, carefully avoiding any mention of the dam or the ongoing legal dispute. The local paper, always eager for a feel-good story, ran a piece praising Willow Glen's future community park, complete with a man-made pond that was apparently in the plans. The irony was sickening, considering they already had a very real reservoir above them, an ancient structure that they were systematically undermining. One afternoon, I received a letter from Willow Glen's lawyer stating that I owed them for damage to some of their construction stakes, as if my very presence had caused that. The letter concluded with a patronizing line: "We trust you'll see the value of cooperating with Willow Glen, as your property is now part of our community." I could have laughed at the absurdity, but mostly I felt a slow burn of rage simmering deeper. They were relentless, and Karen was the tip of the spear. She had the money, the connections, and no scruples about using them. In August, ominous clouds gathered over the horizon, marking the start of what meteorologists predicted would be a wetter than usual rainy season. By that point, the new roads for Willow Glen were partially laid out. The skeletons of at least 20 houses stood framed in timber, and countless more were in the foundation stage. There were glossy promotional signs posted at the entrance to the development, showing cheerful stock photo families strolling through pristine streets. But as I passed by, I saw real workers slogging through ankle-deep mud, cursing under their breath, some of them clearly concerned about the sloppy ground conditions. They put up flimsy plastic barriers to divert water, but I could see the water pooling in spots that were never meant to hold water. The topsoil I once tended so carefully had been ripped away, replaced by a patchwork of raw earth that turned into muck whenever a thunderstorm passed. My anger was tinged with sorrow. It was like watching a piece of my family's heart get trampled under bulldozer treads. Still, Karen boasted of completion dates, assured potential buyers that any concerns were overblown, and insisted that Willow Glen had full confidence in its engineering solutions. I thought about all the solutions Grandpa had taught me. Real solutions, like respecting the natural flow of streams, building drainage in accordance with the land's existing contours, reinforcing the dam's foundation. None of that was part of Willow Glen's blueprint, apparently. Instead, they saw the dam as an unsightly relic. They'd hammered a chunk of it away for one of their extended roads, ignoring the fundamental principle that tampering with a dam's supporting structure is a gamble with enormous stakes. My attorney, Thomas, tried once more to get an emergency injunction, focusing on the public safety angle. But by then, the wheels of bureaucracy were spinning too slowly, and the hearing was scheduled for 3 months down the line. Karen's camp must have been laughing about how they'd likely finish most of the homes by then. One overcast morning, I trudged up the slope to the reservoir for what had become my ritual of observation. I wore boots and a jacket, taking careful steps through the damp underbrush. The air smelled of wet pine needles, and a cool breeze rustled the branches. When I reached the dam, I paused, letting my gaze settle on the sections that looked particularly vulnerable. A chunk of the earthen berm had crumbled away, exposing a patch of stonework that was meant to remain buried and stable. Trickles of water seeped through new cracks, carrying bits of mud with it. It wasn't a catastrophic breach, not yet, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. I made sure to document it on my phone, capturing videos of how the water now found new channels to flow downhill, channels that cut straight through the area where Willow Glen's houses stood. My voice trembled with a cold finality as I narrated the footage, describing every sign of the dam's weakening. I was no saboteur, yet I knew that by refusing to repair what was obviously decaying, I was letting the forces of nature gather momentum. I was letting fate deliver the final blow. The sky turned gray, and thunder rumbled somewhere in the distance. Perfect timing, I thought bitterly, scanning the horizon for signs of an impending storm. That afternoon, the heavens unleashed a deluge. Rain pounded the valley, hammering rooftops, saturating the half-constructed roads until they practically dissolved into muddy rivers. Down at Willow Glen, I saw frantic workers attempt to bail water out of foundation pits. Some used pumps, others tried to line the edges with tarps, but the water just kept coming. The news carried warnings of flash floods. telling people to avoid low-lying areas, and I knew that if the dam finally gave way, low-lying area would take on a horrific new meaning for those 58 new homes. A knot formed in my gut, and I felt that same old conflict between wanting to protect innocent families and wanting Karen to suffer the consequences of her hubris. I stayed up most of the night, watching the storm from my window, hearing the wind howl around the corners of the barn. My phone kept buzzing with weather alerts. The power flickered once or twice, but never fully went out. By dawn, the storm had receded to a gloomy drizzle, leaving the ground soaked and streams running high. I got in my truck and drove toward the dam, my heart pounding at what I might find. On the way, I passed through the edges of Willow Glen. Water still pooled in ditches. Some front yards were partially submerged, though no houses had toppled yet. Karen's beloved SUV was parked on higher ground. She was probably inside one of the portable offices, barking orders at whoever would listen, but I didn't stop to confront her. Not yet. When I reached the turnoff that led up the mountain trail, I could already see the difference in the water level. The reservoir had risen significantly, pressing up against the weakened dam with new force. I parked, jumped out, and began the hike upward. My boots squished into saturated soil that threatened to suck me in. A swirling gust of wind whipped raindrops into my face. With each step, I braced myself for the worst. Near the crest, my breath caught in my throat. A segment of the dam's upper edge had sheared off in the night, creating a jagged opening that allowed a steady stream of water to spill out. It wasn't a full collapse, but it was close. The roar of water rushing through that gap filled my ears, its relentless surge echoing like distant thunder. I inched closer, careful not to stand where the ground might give way under me. My gaze trailed the path of the escaping water as it snaked down the hillside, carving fresh channels into the earth. Those channels led directly toward Willow Glen's far side, near the cluster of half-finished houses. The early morning light revealed one house foundation. Already undermined by the overnight wash, the slab cracked clean through. For a moment, guilt slammed into me, a wave as forceful as the water churning below. People's lives, their savings, their dreams, they were all being swept into a situation they never asked for. Yet part of me whispered that this was not my doing. I had tried to warn them, had tried to hold back the water for years with my own hands. Karen was the one who forced me into a corner, and now the land was responding on its own terms. I didn't know how much longer the dam would hold, so I rushed back down to my truck, intending to drive to the county office or the sheriff's department. Someone needed to see what I'd seen, to understand that a significant flood was imminent if the dam continued to erode. As I neared the area where the new roads intersected, I saw Karen stepping out of her office trailer. She was clearly agitated, phone pressed to her ear, voice raised as she barked something I couldn't make out. I pulled up next to her, rolled down my window, and said, "We're about to have a serious problem. The dam's failing." Karen turned, hair plastered to her face by the lingering rain. She ended the call and glared at me. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "I told you that structure was compromised. The storm last night made it worse. Water's already coming through. If it fully breaks..." She cut me off with a frustrated gesture. "We have drainage systems. Our engineers told me we'd be safe from normal storms. If you think you can blackmail me into stopping construction, you're mistaken." I ground my teeth, scanning her furious expression, noting how the fear danced behind her eyes even as she tried to dismiss me. "This isn't about blackmail," I said, gripping the steering wheel. "Check your lower lots, you'll see the water, and it's going to get 100 times worse if the dam breaks. The land is giving you a reality check." Karen's phone buzzed again. She took the call, turning her back on me. I heard snippets of her frantic conversation, something about a partial evacuation and structural damage. She barked orders to prepare sandbags, but even that sounded more like a show of control than an actual plan. I wanted to say more, but her dismissive wave told me it was pointless. So I drove off, heading straight to the county hall, where I demanded to speak to an official who could do something. By the time I arrived, frantic calls were pouring in from residents complaining of unusual flooding near Willow Glen. The receptionist told me that emergency services were already stretched dealing with smaller flash floods across the region. "If the dam breaks, we'll do what we can," the man at the desk said, sounding overwhelmed. "But from what we understand, Willow Glen is equipped with advanced drainage." I almost laughed at the irony. They'd believed Karen's marketing more than actual geological fact. I stormed back out, uncertain what to do next, torn between a desire to protect lives and a grim sense that no one would heed me until the disaster was undeniable. If the dam gave way entirely, there was no controlling that water. My phone rang as I neared the truck. It was Thomas, my lawyer friend, speaking in a rushed tone. "I've been getting calls from some of the new homeowners," he said. "They're complaining about cracks in the soil, water creeping into basements. They're terrified." "Did you see anything up at the dam?" I took a shaky breath. "Yes. It's partially breached. I don't think it'll hold if another storm cell rolls in, and from the look of the radar, we've got more rain on the way." After strange hollowness in my chest, as I realized we'd reached the point of no return. The coast collapsed, and we reached the point of no return. Large yestudices to hollowness in my chest, as I realized we'd reached the point of no return. I squared away the ground of my chest, as I realized we'd reached the point of no return. I drove back up to the homestead, ignoring the tremors in my hands. As soon as I arrived, I grabbed my binoculars and sprinted to the higher ridge behind the barn that gave me a panoramic view. In the distance, I could see the reservoir swirling like a wrathful beast. The dam's edge had crumbled further, and water now poured over it in a steady torrent. Gritting my teeth, I scanned downward, glimpsing Willow Glen's new houses. A few were half submerged in muddy water. One of the main access roads had transformed into a small river. Machinery lay abandoned, half buried in sludge. Then I saw Karen, or at least I thought it was her, standing on higher ground, phone clutched to her ear, her posture rigid with panic. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I could well imagine her demands for immediate rescue or for some miracle fix to a problem that was far beyond her control. Lightning flashed across the sky, followed by a violent clap of thunder that rattled my bones. The fresh wave of rain came hard and fast, and I knew in my gut that this was it. The dam was going to fail completely, unleashing every gallon of that reservoir onto the unsuspecting development below. I tried to steady my breathing. Guilt, anger, frustration, a sense of inevitability all tangled inside me. This is what happens when you try to build an empire on top of someone else's land without listening to reason. This is what happens when you cut corners, ignore warning signs, and treat nature like an inconvenient obstacle rather than a force to be respected. At that moment, there was a deafening rumble that seemed to reverberate through the earth. My eyes locked on the dam as an entire section of the center caved inward, releasing a torrent of water that rushed out with unstoppable fury. Rocks, debris, and muddy waves cascaded downhill, swallowing the slope, snapping the trunks of smaller trees like matchsticks. I watched, heart hammering, as the water rampaged toward Willow Glen. It struck the first row of houses with brutal force. Walls collapsed in seconds, rooftops torn off and carried by the current. The swirling mass of water and debris devoured everything it touched, morphing the neat suburban layouts into twisted wreckage. I saw cars flipping, entire streets vanishing under the tumult. Even from my vantage point, the roar of the flood was deafening. Like the earth itself was screaming in protest. There was nothing I could do. No quick fix, no last-minute rescue. I simply stared, breath locked in my chest, as nature delivered a lesson more devastating than any legal injunction could. Slowly, the thunder of it all settled to a lower rumble, the water continuing to flow in a wide swath. Where once new homes had stood, there now lay a chaotic landscape of broken beams, shattered glass, and rising pools of filthy brown water. Then came the sirens. Emergency vehicles dotted the main road, but half the area was inaccessible, cut off by the flooding. Helicopters might have been dispatched if the storm hadn't been so intense. I wondered if Karen had made it out unscathed. I wouldn't wish physical harm on her or anybody. But I also knew she bore responsibility for this, and I suspected the law would see it that way too, once the dust settled. I spent the next hours collecting myself, feeling physically ill from the adrenaline. I thought about those unsuspecting families who'd bought into the Willow Glen dream. They were likely left homeless now, or worse. Night fell, and the storm abated, leaving a cold hush over the valley. It was only then that I ventured toward the edge of the devastation, prepared to offer help if needed. The road into the subdivision was destroyed. Along its edges I spotted rescue crews hauling people onto trucks. Some of the half-finished homes were still partially standing, their interiors exposed like dollhouses. Debris was piled everywhere, and the stench of raw earth and broken sewage lines hung in the air. An official in a reflective jacket signaled for me to keep my distance unless I had medical training or official business. I shook my head, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. This wasn't how I wanted to reclaim my land. Yet I couldn't deny the grim satisfaction that Willow Glen's arrogance had finally been confronted. News cameras arrived at dawn, capturing the wreckage in crisp detail. They interviewed county officials, baffled by how the project got approval in the first place. They interviewed displaced homeowners, in shock that their idyllic new dream was wiped out in a single night. And yes, eventually someone stuck a microphone in my face. I told them the truth, that I'd repeatedly warned about the dam's compromised state, that I'd filed complaints, that I'd tried to get Willow Glen to address it, but they ignored me. The reporters ate it up, especially when I showed them the stack of evidence. Karen was nowhere to be found on camera, though I heard rumors she'd been seen wading through chest-high water near the destroyed sales office, screaming into her phone for help. Over the next few days, as the floodwaters receded, a different kind of storm descended: investigations, lawsuits, and blame games. County inspectors uncovered serious irregularities, from incomplete environmental reviews to under-the-table donations made by Willow Glen to certain officials' re-election campaigns. It didn't take long for Karen's shining reputation to crumble under the weight of scandal. Homeowners, outraged and penniless, joined forces to sue the HOA, the contractors, the county, anyone who played a role in the fiasco. Insurance adjusters arrived, only to inform them that acts of God and disregard for structural safety guidelines invalidated many claims. While Karen scrambled to salvage her personal finances and what remained of her public standing, I began rebuilding the dam. Even though it had released its pent-up fury, the reservoir remained a critical part of controlling water flow in our region. I coordinated with a few local volunteers who remembered the old ways of shoring up earthen structures. The work was hard, often muddy, and complicated by leftover debris from the flood, but for the first time in months, I felt a sense of purpose, as if I was carrying on Grandpa's legacy in a tangible way. I wasn't alone either. A few concerned townspeople pitched in, along with an old friend who had excavation equipment. We repaired the broken sections, added reinforcements, and redirected the creek to flow properly once again. It took weeks, but by the end, the dam stood stronger than ever. A silent testament to the fact that you don't need big money or fancy degrees to respect nature's power. Meanwhile, Willow Glen remained a soggy ghost town. Some of the houses that had only been partially built were condemned, others were flattened entirely. The roads were torn up, the sidewalks cracked, and the entire site looked like a cautionary tale about defying nature. Karen's name became synonymous with hubris and mismanagement. Local politicians scrambled to distance themselves, blaming each other for fast-tracking permits without due diligence. Investigations were ongoing, and rumors spread that Karen might face criminal charges for negligence. Eventually, the county recognized that the portion of land forcibly zoned into Willow Glen never legitimately belonged there. With the development in ruins and the HOA bankrupt, they had no legal grounds to keep it, so in a quiet meeting, the zoning was reversed and I regained undisputed ownership. The hollow victory tasted bittersweet. Yes, the land was back under my name, but it came at the cost of a catastrophic flood that left many innocent people homeless. I spent a lot of time reflecting on whether there had been a different path. Could I have convinced Karen to listen or forced the county to intervene sooner? Maybe. But no one can rewrite the past. All I could do was move forward, piece by piece, ensuring that no other misguided enterprise would dare to repeat Willow Glen's mistakes on this land. In the aftermath, people often approached me, asking if I felt vindicated or triumphant. My answers were never simple. The truth is, I felt relief that the threat to my birthright was gone, but also sorrow for the families who got caught up in the scheme. Some journalists sensationalized the story, painting me as the man who let the dam break. I'd read lines implying I had a hand in causing the flood, or that I was the one who triggered it. But no matter what they wrote, I slept at night knowing I had tried to warn them. The water was always there, waiting to remind humanity that we never truly own land, we merely borrow it. By the time the final lawsuits were settled and the last of the news vans drove off, Willow Glen had faded from most people's minds. A year passed, then another, grass and wildflowers reclaimed the broken foundations, and what was once a symbol of corporate ambition became a forgotten patch of empty lots. Karen, I heard through the grapevine, sold off everything she could to pay legal fees. She disappeared from the local scene, rumored to be living several states away in relative obscurity, presumably nursing her grudges. As for me, I continued to farm my grandfather's land, replanting fields that had been bulldozed and working to restore the delicate balance of water channels. Over time, I let go of the anger I harbored, focusing instead on preserving the dam for future generations. I even posted signs around the perimeter, explaining the dam's history and cautioning hikers about the importance of respecting the structure. The signs also served as a reminder of what had happened. This area was once threatened by poor planning and greed. Let it stand as a warning. Tourists occasionally wandered by, curious about the local legend of a man who flooded a new subdivision to reclaim his land. They asked me questions, sometimes with a note of skepticism, sometimes with wide-eyed fascination. I usually shrugged off the dramatics. The real story was about nature holding all the cards and about how easily people forget that fact until it's too late. On certain nights, especially when the moon was bright and the air was calm, I'd sit on the rebuilt dam and stare out at the reservoir. The water reflected the stars, a quiet mirror of the vast sky. If I closed my eyes, I could almost hear Grandpa's voice, telling me how he and his neighbors lugged stones and timber up this slope, determined to protect the valley from another devastating flood. The difference now was that I held the knowledge of a more modern era, and I'd witnessed a brutal reminder of what happens when we discount the land's natural order. In those moments, I felt a surge of gratitude that the land was still in my care, free from the meddling of suits and developers. Yet a part of me also felt the faint echo of regret that the lesson had to come in the form of a flood that destroyed so many hopes, but maybe that was the only way some people would ever pay attention, by confronting a disaster that no zoning map or bribe could contain. From time to time, local teens would share ghost stories about Willow Glen, claiming they heard voices among the ruins or saw shadowy figures wandering where houses once stood. Their tales, mostly exaggerations, served as a reminder that places touched by disaster often soak up a certain energy. It was a far cry from the curated brochures Karen had once handed out, promising a utopia of manicured lawns and community spirit. Ironically, the only community spirit that place had now was the handful of wildlife returning to forage among the tall grass and fallen beams. The new county commissioners, in an effort to prevent history from repeating, implemented stricter regulations for any future developments near the reservoir. I attended a few town hall meetings, quietly giving input from my first-hand experience. Most of them listened politely, some nodded with appreciation, a few eyed me warily, as if I was the man who single-handedly conjured a flood for revenge. I let them think what they wanted. My conscience was as clear as it could be after witnessing that chain of events. I'd found a form of justice not in the courtroom, but in the unyielding power of natural forces. On the second anniversary of the flood, I found myself unexpectedly invited to speak at a local college's environmental science seminar. The professor, who'd read about the Willow Glen fiasco, wanted me to share a real-world example of how environmental ignorance leads to tragedy. Standing at a podium, looking out at a sea of young, inquisitive faces, I recounted the story of how Karen bulldozed across farmland and a dam without respecting the delicate balance of water flow. I told them how the county's red tape and shady backroom deals enabled her to keep building until it was too late. I concluded by urging them that if they go into any field involving land use, they should remember that nature isn't something you conquer, it's something you cooperate with. The applause was polite, tinged with an undercurrent of sobering awareness. Afterward, a few students approached me, full of questions about the technical aspects of the dam or the legal side of what had happened. Answering them gave me hope that maybe the next generation would be more mindful than Karen's crowd had been. Late that night, as I returned home, I took a detour through the edges of the old Willow Glen site. The moonlight exposed the skeletal remains of roads that led nowhere. A few partial foundations still jutted up from the ground like gravestones, marking a dream that drowned beneath its own arrogance. Pausing for a moment, I got out of the truck. A light breeze rustled the tall grass. I stood there, remembering the day I'd first confronted Karen, how she'd brushed off my warnings as if I were a stubborn old relic. The sound of distant frogs echoed in the darkness as water trickled through the faint channels that were once brand new drainage ditches. Maybe, I thought, the best outcome for this place is to let it return to nature, to allow the fields to heal from the scars inflicted by greed. I took one last look at the battered remnants under the moon's pale glow, then climbed back into my truck and drove home. My heart felt heavy but resolute. Although life eventually found a new equilibrium, I never forgot the sense of foreboding I experienced each time I walked the dam, noticing fresh cracks or hearing the distant hum of construction. Nor did I forget the look of betrayal on those homeowners' faces who'd realized they'd bought into a scam. But what lingered most vividly was the deafening roar of water as it claimed the land from those who believed they could simply overwrite reality with a zoning permit. That roar was etched in my memories, a reminder that while we humans might scribble lines on maps and hand out official stamps, the land has a will of its own. Now, whenever clouds roll in and thunder shakes the windows of my grandfather's old farmhouse, I feel a twinge of anxiety. I hurry to the dam with a flashlight and a firm resolve to keep it strong, because if there's one lesson I refuse to forget, it's that the power I hold is not to dominate nature, but to safeguard the delicate balance that keeps these fields, this valley, and my home safe. Karen learned that lesson too late. She tried to rebuild the valley in her own image, ignoring the warnings of those who knew better. In the end, all her bravado and money couldn't stand against a wall of water. And so, if anyone ever asked me why I allowed that flood to happen, I might just shake my head and say, The land made its own choice. It remembered the promise my grandfather once made, to let water flow where it should, unobstructed by vanity or greed. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly how it was meant to be.